Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, and thank you to the library. Thank you to the league for inviting me to do this. I always love talking about redistricting. And this is especially relevant right now because literally as we speak, the House, the State House is discussing a congressional plan, the one I have on the bottom here. The current congressional districts in Kansas look like the top here. We are in District 4, at least if you're watching from Wichita. And this is the plan that has already passed the state Senate late last week. It passed the House Redistricting Committee yesterday, and today is being debated by the full House. It's probably going to be passed today, and then it'll be sent off to the governor. So we can come back, circle around near the end and talk about what this looks like. We also have a state House and state Senate plan to pass, or the state legislature has to by the end of the session, and we can get into that. But before we dig into a specific plan, we can talk about, well, why are we doing this now? So why are we redistricting? Why does it have to happen this session? We can talk about why we want districts to look a certain way. So why are, for instance, why are most of these counties like contained whole in a particular district? What other requirements are placed on the redistricting process? And is it different in Kansas versus other states? Yeah, so I can dig into this. So why are we doing this now? And the answer is we are required to by the US Constitution, or at least how the Supreme Court has interpreted the US Constitution since the 1960s. And that's because we just had a census. So the census happens every 10 years, years ending in a 0. So hopefully you took that survey when it came to you a couple years ago. And the census released a big set of data in August of last year, and that kind of kicked off the redistricting process. If we go back in history, so that the census was partly put into place in the Constitution back in the 18th century because of House districts. Initially, this was to determine how many districts in the US House each state got. So that the founders wanted that to be roughly proportional. Obviously, people move around the country or they get new people from other countries settling in different states. So as populations change, the amount of representation each state gets needs to change as well. So that's supposed to be an automatic process. Nowadays, it's basically an automatic process. As states grow, they'll get more representation. As states either shrink or don't grow as fast, they get less representation. So we've seen those counts released about a year ago. States like Florida and Texas have grown very quickly, so they have gained representation. Rust Belt states have declined in population or haven't been growing as fast, so they've lost some representation. But actually post-Civil War and the 100 years following that, a new problem grew. And that was not between states and their representation, but within states and their representation. One example I can show you are this was the state Senate map that was placed from the late 40s up until the 1960s when they were forced to change this map. So the districts and the numbers are the district numbers. The outlines are county lines here. And this was a pretty typical approach to legislative districts.
Can you see it?
I'm going to mute somebody here. Okay. So you can see here that no county is split, which you might think is a good thing. This looks like nice logical lines. But once you start thinking about it, you say, wait, Wichita here in the 27th has one representative, but so does Butler County, so does Hutchinson, so does, Kansas City, that might make sense, but so do some of these counties around them, down here in the southeast corner of the state. Those counties have very different population, especially today, but even back 60, 70, 80 years ago. And yeah, that is, it took a lot more votes to win a seat in the 27th versus in the, let's say the 30th or the 18th up on the northern border. And you can also think of this in terms of representation. Each individual voter in these more rural areas was being better represented or had more power in influencing a representative than somebody in Sedgwick County, for instance. The state house map was even worse in Kansas because every single county was guaranteed its own representative and no county was allowed more than 3. So Geary County, the smallest county with a handful of thousands of people, got a single representative, or Wichita or Sedgwick County with hundreds of thousands of people, even back then, only got 3. So there's a massive disparity in representation. And this turns out to not just be a Kansas problem at this time. This was happening all over the country. Like I said, this really developed middle of the 19th century up until the middle of the 20th century as people were moving from rural areas to urban areas. This is a trend that still continues today. In general, we were seeing rural areas not lose their representation as they were losing population. And this became a civil rights issue because urban areas tended to be more where minority populations lived. So in the Midwest and the Northeast, the Great Migration of Black citizens from the South to the North. They tended to settle in cities like Detroit and Milwaukee. And they were being greatly underrepresented when it came to elections. And the initial, for a very long time, the US Supreme Court and the federal courts in general said, this is a political issue. If you have a problem with this, elect different representatives and have them draw a new map or have a new strategy on this. But eventually, as the court became more active in civil rights issues, the Supreme Court came down and said, you know what, this is actually a basic constitutional right. We have these guarantees of equal protection under the law, and we do need equality here. So in 1962, the court signaled that, yes, we're going to get into redistricting. And then 1964, we had a few landmark cases where they said, the famous quote is, legislators represent people, not trees or acres. And they said, once we get new census data, once we know how people have moved throughout the state, you need to redraw your district lines so that the populations between districts within the state are roughly equal. So that has kicked off why we do this. Usually, 2021, 2022, right after the census data comes out, we are required to do this everywhere. And not just congressional lines, but state legislative lines, so state house, state senate, but also county commission. We just went through this with Sedgwick County, and we will eventually have to do this with city commissions. So Wichita is going to have to deal with this as well. So that's why we do this and why we do this specifically now. We can talk about who draws these lines, because obviously who's in charge of the process is going to have a big influence on how it works out. And this is going to vary state by state, but Kansas is pretty normal on this. The most common way of doing this is basically like any other bill that a state would pass. So specifically, the state legislature will pass a bill that has the new map, and the governor will either sign or veto that. If you're thinking strategically, or you're thinking of what that might look like in Kansas, well, Kansas, the House and Senate in Kansas are both overwhelmingly Republicans. So not just a majority, but a supermajority. So they basically control the process in the legislature. And as we'll discuss, the congressional plan that's just about to be passed is being accused of being a Republican-oriented plan. What's interesting, though, is that we may be a mostly Republican state in general, but we elected a Democratic governor back in 2018, Laura Kelly, and she has the power to veto any plan that goes through. Like I said, the Senate has already passed the plan that I showed you before. It's very likely that the House will pass it. And Governor Kelly has not yet signaled if she's going to veto that plan or not. She would have good reason to. I think a lot of Democrats would encourage her to, but that would be the next step in the process, her either approving it or vetoing it. If she does veto it, it can go back to the legislature, just like any other bill, and they can override that veto. And like I said, Republicans in both chambers have supermajority margins, so they could override that veto, assuming that all Republicans stay on board. After that point, with the congressional plan, that would go into effect if either the governor signs it or if she vetoes it and it's overridden by the legislature. With state legislative districts, it would then go to the state Supreme Court for a legal review. So that's a basic process. Again, just like any other bill and the politics that go with passing bills in the state of Kansas. Okay, in terms of what a map has to look like, Kansas has very few restrictions on the process. It essentially has none beyond what federal law requires. And it turns out federal law doesn't require much either. So I've already talked about one. So every map that is drawn, from congressional down to city commission, they need to think about equal population requirements for the reason I've already discussed. When it comes to congressional plans, the interpretation has been usually exact equality. So Kansas, our population happens to be divisible by 4. So every single, all 4 districts in that plan that I showed you has exact equal population. There can be some leeway for good reasons. So if there was a map that didn't split any counties, they might allow a leeway of a few hundred people, maybe a few thousand people. But generally speaking, congressional plans have to have exact equal population. With state legislative plans, there's more leeway traditionally, usually a maximum variation of 10% in population. So you can think of what the ideal population would be for exact equality. You can have a district that's 5% above, a district that's 5% below. As long as you're not doing that in a discriminatory fashion, that's usually allowable. The only other federal requirements here are from generally the Voting Rights Act and protections against racial discrimination, racial and ethnic discrimination. So I say here, basic idea, don't discriminate based on race. In practical terms, since the late 1980s, there has been a institution known as the majority minority district. And this is the idea that if there is a minority community within a state that's relatively geographically compact, like if they make a clear local community, and if they vote differently than the majority community in their area. So, if you divided up that community, watered down their voices, if they wouldn't be able to have their choice if that happened, well, then you have to draw a district where they are the majority, or at least they are enough of a voice where they can elect the candidate of their choosing. Here in Kansas, for congressional districts, that requirement doesn't really kick in because the Black, Hispanic communities aren't large enough to do that. But with state house districts, that is relevant. If you look at Kansas City, parts of Wichita, southwestern Kansas, those are going to be relevant requirements. So like I said, these are the only laws that apply everywhere. They apply to Kansas at all levels. So these are things that have to be thought about. Beyond that, though, states can put additional requirements on themselves. Again, Kansas doesn't really do this. They can require, for instance, single member districts. So we have 125 members of the state house. That means they have to draw 125 districts, electing 1 member apiece. But there are things that people generally want out of plans and generally are followed. A basic one is what's referred to as contiguity. And I'm giving you an example of non-contiguity here. The basic idea is a district should be a single piece of geography. You should be able to go from one point in a district to any other point in that district without having to leave that district. The example I have here is the state house map from Madison, Wisconsin, and they have non-contiguity. You can see like the 79th has these little islands in the middle of the 78th district, all over the place. They have these little flecks of geography that don't connect with the rest of the district. They're able to get away with this or justify this because the city of Madison itself has these holes in it, and the townships that surround it, kind of the unincorporated parts of the county, fill these holes. So if you look at it from like a ward precinct level, like this island here will connect to another part of the purple district. So I just interpret contiguity a little bit differently. But if you look at, for instance, county commission districts in Kansas, a lot of counties do non-contiguous districts. There's no state law requiring that. Another requirement that people tend to prefer is compactness. And this is often one of those things where you know it when you see it. Again, I've given you an example where you know it when it's not there. This is just the basic idea that districts should be nice, normal geometric shapes. They should look like squares or rectangles, or oftentimes a circle is an ideal here. So this is the Maryland, kind of Washington, DC to Baltimore area from the previous decade. They have since passed new plans, but yeah, this is a highly not compact set of districts. Yeah, and from a redistricting standpoint, you can think, what does somebody who lives down here in the center of the Washington to Baltimore metro area have in common with, if we're going all the way out to probably a wealthier, more rural part of the district out in the Northeast. And why are they connected with somebody in Northwest Baltimore City? And the answer is it's what the U.S. House candidates wanted, the Democrats who drew this map. But yeah, there's an obvious reason why you wouldn't want these non-compact districts from a representational standpoint. In terms of a good map on compactness, we currently have this map in place. I've shown you this already. I guess I didn't mention process-wise. It is required that new plans get drawn. As I said, equal population requirements are mandated by the Constitution. So if the legislature were to fail to pass something, courts can step in and kind of put something in place for the legislature. And that's exactly what happened 10 years ago. This was a map selected by a court, and you can see that they chose a relatively compact arrangement. Again, kind of nice rectangular districts, or even kind of circular districts here. But that's what we would want out of a plan, all else equal. Illinois just passed this plan. Again, another good example of a highly non-compact map. So this is the Chicago area here. This is the full state. Again, this is something where we often can know it when we see it, but there are ways to put number values on how compact or not compact a map is. And that's something a court would look at if somebody were challenging a map on these grounds. Other things we might be interested in, following existing boundaries, or another way of phrasing this would be, don't split counties if you don't have to, or don't split cities if you don't have to. Iowa has been traditionally kind of a rock star on this when it comes to their congressional lines, partly because they have just a bunch of counties with not many people living in them. They're able to draw congressional districts that don't split any counties and get within, I think, 100 voters, or within 100 people per district from the ideal. So again, that's one of those cases where population isn't exactly equal, but there's a good reason for it. This is the map that's currently in place, but they've done it again for the map that's going to take place come this next election cycle. So again, this is an ideal version of it. We can go back to, obviously, Illinois is doing a lot of splitting here. Last requirement I will touch on, or not requirement, guideline that we might want to follow, is this idea of communities of interest. And the basic idea here is that there are groups of people with different identities that have certain legislative needs. They have certain preferences that maybe go beyond party, where splitting them up across multiple districts would weaken their voice and maybe not allow them to get the kind of representation they would want. Whereas if we kept them together in a single district, they could elect somebody that would help represent that interest. I've already talked a little bit about racial and ethnic communities. Those are mandated by the Voting Rights Act to be respected, but there are other things we might be interested in protecting or giving a voice to. So, at a very broad level, we can think about, for congressional plans, a person living in Newton or a person living in Andover, they live in a different county than Sedgwick with Wichita, but obviously a lot of people who live in those kind of suburbs have connections with Wichita. A lot of people living there commute in to work. They might, if they're going shopping on the weekend, come into Wichita to do that. So there is a community tie there. You know, compare that to like Hutchinson, there's less of a less strong tie there. So if we're drawing congressional districts, we might think that it is more important to keep Butler and Harvey counties together with Sedgwick, and Reno County with Hutch, we might be more willing to split off. And this is exactly the kind of argument with the map that's being debated right now, where Wyandotte County, Kansas City is getting split up. That's kind of and along with Johnson County, the suburbs to the south, getting split up might deny some of that community linkage. But beyond that, there could be issues like socioeconomic status. If we're looking at state house districts where Wichita might be divided into 10 or a dozen different districts, maybe we want to keep like the wealthier kind of subdivisions in East Wichita, separate from the more working class kind of central southern areas of Wichita. They might have different needs and different legislative wants from their representatives. And by drawing districts that group those people together, they can elect somebody who is from the community and knows them well. In practice, it's difficult to determine what is an interest that needs protecting beyond the legally mandated ones. So this can be open to debate, but it is something worth thinking about as somebody draws a plan. Okay, that does bring us to the question of partisanship. Is that something we need to think about when we draw district lines? At a basic level, is gerrymandering legal? Is it legal to draw a map that benefits one party over the other? Well, sometimes we use the language of gerrymandering to refer to racial gerrymandering. So this is an example from New Jersey. So this is like Northeast New Jersey. You can kind of see Manhattan and Staten Island just over the river here. And you might look at this, like let's say the arrangement of 8 and 10 here and say, those are weird shaped districts. Why is District 8 kind of a backwards C here? Is something partisan going on here? And it turns out no. This whole area is very, very democratic. So yeah, basically no matter how you draw the districts here, they're all going to be overwhelmingly Democrat. What's going on here is this District 8 is connecting a bunch of Hispanic communities, whereas District 10 is connecting a bunch of Black communities. Again, some of this is motivated by the Voting Rights Act and compelled by the Voting Rights Act. So district shapes can be a little bit misleading, although it is possible to go overboard here. So this was a district that was passed in North Carolina last decade, and it basically connected a bunch of African-American neighborhoods up and down the state. You can see statewide, this almost runs the whole span of the state. And the Supreme Court has ruled on a lot of different cases over the decades relating to race. And general idea is that racial discrimination is not allowed. Racial gerrymandering to hinder a racial minority from being well represented, that's pretty well established case law. That is not allowed. The problem that you would run into is where race is the only factor that's going into drawing a district. And this 12th district, I say it's the former 12th district because it did get struck down in court for going too far or factoring in race to the exclusion of everything else. So again, racial gerrymandering, not allowed. Partisan gerrymandering, well, we can start by talking about what a partisan gerrymander looks like and doesn't look like or can look like, because it is kind of complicated. It might seem simple. We might see that Illinois district map that I showed you and say, that's gotta be a gerrymander. But it can be a little bit more difficult to identify. And that's been relevant when it comes to how federal courts have looked at this. So as an example of how gerrymandering works, I have this, let's imagine this is a state with 30 different voters. 60% of them vote for the purple party, 40% of them vote for the gray party, and they need to draw 3 districts. Well, if you're thinking proportionally, it would make sense that 2 of these districts would go for the purple party, 1 district would go for the gray party. But if you put the purple party in charge of drawing the districts, they can just draw kind of 2 horizontal lines here and have a map where they're electing 3 representatives. So each of these districts has 6 purple voters and 4 gray voters. So even though 40% of the voters are gray party, purple is winning all of these districts. And if I just showed you a box with 2 horizontal lines in it, you would say, well, those are really compact districts. This makes sense. How could this be a gerrymander? But again, under the hood, if we're looking at actual votes, there's something going on here where purple is able to win all of these districts. On the flip side, we can think about what the gray party would do if they wanted to, maximize their own benefit. And what they would do is they would take 1 district where 10 purple voters were the entire district, there were no gray voters there, and kind of allow them to win that district by an overwhelming margin. Once you do that, though, you can look at what's left over for the other 2 districts, and they can draw 2 districts that have 6 gray voters and 4 purple voters. So even though they're 40% of the voters, they can win 2/3 of the districts. And this is just kind of a toy example of the basic idea behind a gerrymander. We sometimes refer to this as packing and cracking. So packing would be what's happening on the right here. So in most cases, a party can't win every single district in a state, but what they can do is say, okay, these handful of districts on the map, we're going to allow our opponents to win. And we're going to take as many of our opponents' voters and pack them into this district. And when they do that, if you look at the districts outside of those packed districts, well, proportionally, they're now more your party. They're more in favor of your party. So you might say, well, an overwhelming win is great for the purple party, but no, you're actually wasting purple votes here. You only need 6 voters to win a district. You have 4 extra votes in this district that you're wasting. And then once you have packed certain districts, the flip side of the strategy is to crack the remaining ones. So we can see that in the middle map here, where there are 12 voters here for the gray party, but if you split them up so that they are a minority in each district, then you are doing great for your own party. The idea here would be that you want to draw districts where your party wins by a comfortable margin, but you're not overpacking it and wasting your own voters. So again, packing and cracking is the general idea behind a partisan gerrymander. But again, identifying this can be difficult unless you have the data and really look into it. So this is the map that is currently in place in Indiana and has been for the past decade. And again, this is an example of a nice compact map. They're not doing a lot of splitting of counties here. Visually, you might say that this is a good plan. But we can look at the partisan breakdown. So 2008 was so this would have been drawn in 2011. So if they're looking at the most recent presidential election, that would be 2008. This is a state that Barack Obama won in 2008. But if you break down these 9 districts, he only won a majority in 2 of the 9 districts. And you can see it's, Indianapolis district and then kind of the Chicago suburbs district. So it might look good from a compactness standpoint, but it is doing this packing of overwhelming victories in a couple districts, and it's doing cracking everywhere else. None of these losses for Democrats are that small. They're still getting 45% of the vote on average, but that's what a Republican strategy would tell you to do. They only want victories of a few points where it's safe, but not too safe. Now, granted, Indiana since 2008 has gone quite a bit more Republican, so these margins are very different now than they used to be. But again, with the data they had when the plan was drawn, this is what things looked like. And this idea of Indianapolis, Chicago suburbs, this is kind of a pattern we find everywhere. And it kind of raises the question of identifying gerrymanders. So Wisconsin would be another good example here, where, where do Democrats live in Wisconsin? Well, there's a lot of very overwhelming Democratic precincts in Milwaukee. There's a lot in Madison and the surrounding area, and not much elsewhere. There are a lot of kind of lean Republican precincts everywhere else. You can see little dots of Democratic towns and cities throughout the state. But the problem that Democrats can run into is that they have sort of gerrymandered themselves, or at least that's what Republicans use to justify some of the maps that they passed. If you want a compact district, going back to this example, well, it makes sense to keep Indianapolis whole and compact. And it's Democrats' fault that they overwhelmingly tend to live in cities and aren't spread out more efficiently across the rest of the state. Where the debate comes up, though, is how, if we do have a district plan, for instance, in Wisconsin, where in 2016, for instance, Democrats won a majority of the state House vote, or they call it the state assembly vote, but won only about just over a third of the seats. And the question is, how much is sorting and how much is gerrymandering, where Republicans drawing the map, or in Illinois, for instance, Democrats drawing the map. What's the balance there? What's responsible for this imbalance in representation? So how do we actually test this? So how do we test if a map is a gerrymander, or if it's just Democrats segregating themselves from Republicans by living in cities and urban cores? So there are a lot of different metrics that have been invented in the past 50, 60 years to put number values on what the balance is between Democrats, Republicans, how many voters they have versus how many seats they win. So this is output from a website called Plan Score. They're an anti-gerrymandering kind of activist group. And there are measures here like the efficiency gap, which measures how many votes are being wasted by each party. They have other more kind of in the weeds measures of how Republican or Democratic a map might be. And there's a lot of theory that goes behind what values do we reach where we should start thinking about a map being a gerrymander. And this is the output for actually the Astra map, the one that is currently being debated and passed in the Kansas state legislature. But what we can do beyond just having these numbers, which may be difficult to interpret, is to compare it to other maps. So kind of the new trend over the past 10 years has been having computers go in and create a bunch of random plans that meet basic minimum legal standards. So for instance, this distribution here is kind of what a bunch of different simulated plans would look like on this particular measure. And this is saying that, well, the Ad Astra plan that the State House is currently debating is on the more Republican side in terms of gerrymandering than the average plan. The average plan still has a little bit of a Republican lean. It's not quite in the middle of being balanced, but it is not as extreme as is seen in the plan that's being debated. And in general, we can look at different plans that have been proposed, or the status quo plan, for instance, and see what changes have been made or what differences are. For instance, if there is a plan that's been introduced that is as good as a plan that's being passed on compactness and on splitting counties and cities, but is more biased towards one party or the other, that's a good sign that gerrymandering is happening. So yeah, the Democrats have introduced their own plans to the legislature, and the League of Women Voters, for instance, have introduced their own plan or had somebody introduce a plan on their behalf. And they'd make the argument that it's as good or better on the neutral criteria, and it's also as good or better on the partisan side of things. So I guess I still haven't answered the question of, is partisan gerrymandering illegal? Well, this was kind of a fuzzy, rough area to answer for the past few decades. In the 1980s, the Supreme Court signaled that they might actually consider making partisan gerrymandering illegal, or at least having some level of protection for partisanship. And they laid out some ideas for tests of how this might be proven. The idea of, is there an intent to discriminate? So does it seem like if Republicans control the process entirely, does it look like the plan is drawn to discriminate against Democrats or vice versa? Did they succeed in their discriminatory effect? And then finally, is there a valid underpinning to the plan? So can they justify the map that was passed based on compactness, not splitting counties? Again, like, can they blame everything on sorting instead of on gerrymandering? Well, this idea got put forward, but for decades, no map was being struck down for partisan gerrymandering because no real clear plan on showing, what was a valid underpinning versus a not valid underpinning. How far does a map have to be discriminatory before we consider it too discriminatory on partisanship? There was no clear plan that any map could be plugged into where the answer would be yes, this is a gerrymander, no, this is not a gerrymander. At least none that the Supreme Court or the federal courts could agree on. Political scientists, a lot of activists put forward a lot of different plans, but there was no point where the federal court said this is the one. So we can fast forward now to a few years ago, and in 2017, 2018, we did see the state of Wisconsin, or at least the federal district courts in Wisconsin, take up a challenge on the state assembly plan and rule that yes, their plan was discriminatory as a partisan gerrymander. The Democrats or the groups that were challenging the plan put forward this test that the federal courts in the state said were a good test and were met in this particular case, and it eventually got appealed up to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately for gerrymandering activists, the Supreme Court did not agree with the test and kind of punted on the plan. So they sent it back down to lower courts. Anthony Kennedy had been sort of that swing vote where the liberal wing of the court at the time were 4 voters. They said, yes, there is a good test here. We should make partisan gerrymandering illegal. There were 4 conservatives who were saying, no, there's no test here. This is not something we should be dealing with Kennedy in the middle saying that we shouldn't stop looking for it, that I haven't seen the test I'm interested in yet. Well, Kennedy retired after the 2018 session. Obviously was replaced by somebody nominated by a Republican. So it ended up being another conservative vote. And come 2019 with Rucho versus Common Cause, the case, the Supreme Court kind of put their foot down and said, this is not something we can decide on. This is just not the realm for federal courts. It's kind of like going back to pre-1960s with the equal population requirements. Before that point, they just said, this is a political question. If you have a problem with it, elect new representatives or have Congress pass a law to ban partisan gerrymandering. Don't have the federal courts, the federal courts just aren't the ones to deal with this. So that's where we are today. The federal courts have stepped out of this debate completely. And if a particular state wants to take on partisan gerrymandering, they essentially have to do it at the state level or get Congress to pass a law against it, which Democrats have passed reform bills on this, but hasn't gotten through like filibusters in the Senate. So we have seen movement on this at the state level. So these tend to be states where they have direct democracy institutions where they can put initiatives on the ballot directly. So somebody can go and collect a bunch of signatures and say, hey, we want to vote on this directly. We want to go around the legislature and make gerrymandering illegal. And a lot of states have gone towards independent redistricting commissions where an even balance of Democrats and Republicans who aren't associated with the legislature would be in charge of drawing maps, and those would be the ones put into place instead of having politicians do it. Unfortunately for Kansas, if you are reform-minded, we don't have these types of tools available to us. We don't have the ballot initiative. So some states have gone through the legislature. We have seen that succeed. Those protections tend to be a bit weaker, or if things fail, they go to the legislature for kind of as a backup. And they have tended to be in more competitive states where it's not clear who's going to be in charge of the redistricting process in the future. Other avenues here are state courts. So some states have had success with finding protections against gerrymandering in the state constitution. So Pennsylvania would be a good example here, but the Kansas Constitution doesn't have that same kind of language, at least not that Pennsylvania uses. Yeah, so as I said, where should the lines be drawn? Should there be specific requirements on compactness and not splitting counties? All of the things I've already mentioned. And who should draw those lines? Should there be independent commissions, or should it still be the legislature? Okay, so I'm at about 45 minutes. So I can quickly go over this Ad Astra plan. So this is, again, the map that is, I haven't been checking. They were debating in the House when I was starting. I don't know if they've had a vote yet. So I showed you before what the current districts look like. The fourth where we live with Wichita is essentially unchanged. This district's almost identical to what it was before. The really big differences are kind of the northern half of Kansas City and Wyandotte County. This used to be part of the 3rd. So that's the one Democratic district in the state currently, with Sharice Davids holding that seat. Currently, that is all of Wyandotte, Johnson County, and part of Miami County. Johnson County especially has grown very quickly. So we can't have a district that is all of Wyandotte and Johnson County anymore. One of these two counties would have to be split. The Democrats have tended to take the approach of keeping Kansas City whole and then splitting off maybe the southern or the western parts of Johnson County, kind of the more rural outer exurbs of the county, and keeping that whole. Obviously, the Republicans, Ad Astra plan was introduced by Republicans. They've chosen to split off Kansas City, add it to the 2nd, and head south and west with it. The upshot of this is that this is a less Democratic district than it was before, although it is still a district that Joe Biden won in 2020 by at least a few points. I believe somewhere around +5 for Biden. So if you plug this into plan score, like I showed you before, this is still favored to be a Democratic district. It's just less safe than it was before. One of the other major things that Democrats are pointing out and not liking is that Lawrence is, if we were thinking about compactness and keeping counties whole, it would make sense for Lawrence to be in the 2nd district, kind of take these more central counties, add them to the 1st, and keep Lawrence in the 2nd, maybe add these two counties back to the 2nd as well. Obviously, if you add Kansas City, if you take that out of the 3rd and add it to the 2nd, you take a district that was sort of still safe Republican, although in a good year could be competitive, and you make it more Democratic. If you leave Lawrence in there, it becomes even more Democratic. So if you're thinking strategically as a Republican, taking Lawrence out of the equation, which is possibly the most dense Democratic area in the state, and throwing it into the 1st, which is combined with these very, very rural Republican areas, kind of waters down the chances for Democrats in the 2nd. But yeah, that's kind of an overview. We haven't seen any plans introduced for the state legislature yet, for the state House or state Senate. Presumably that's what they're going to pick up once the congressional plans are completed, again, probably today. Yeah, so are we getting questions here? I can throw back to Julie and the other moderators here.
Going back to the strategy of a party gerrymander, what would have been an example of a non-gerrymandered split?
So do you have a specific place that you were looking at for that, or just in general?
We're showing strategy of a party gerrymander. There's a
okay.
It's split up, and it's 60% purple and 40% gray. And when it was 2 gray and 1 purple, that showed packing, and when it
Yeah.
was 3, yeah.
Yeah, so again, there's no requirement for proportionality, but generally, I think good government kind of anti-gerrymandering reformers use just proportionality as the basic idea. Or at the very least, if you win a majority of the votes, do you win a majority of the seats? So in this plan, yes, some combination of 2 purple districts and 1 gray district would be the closest to that. Where those lines fall exactly, you can do a lot of different combinations here, but yeah.
Does it need to be 3 districts, or could it be 2 districts going right down the the gray purple lines?
So they would have to have the same number of people in each.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so that is, traditionally that's been an approach that state legislatures have used, changing the number of representatives, but in recent decades, those are usually pretty fixed. So they have their number and that's what they're going with.
Okay, and there is another question. Doesn't the Astra map by splitting Wyandotte County disadvantage Black voters? Also, doesn't it put Lawrence with Western Kansas and therefore basically disenfranchise progressive voters in Kansas? And what can be challenged in this map?
Yeah, so those are good questions. This kind of the northeastern part of Kansas City is the Black and Hispanic areas of the city. So they've kind of cleaved that off of a lot of the rest of the 3rd district. So yes, that's the argument being made, is that this is disadvantaging Black voters. Yeah, I mentioned, I think you might have asked the question before I got to it. Yeah, splitting off Lawrence and adding it to the 1st is obviously making it difficult for progressives in that area to have the representation that they want. And yeah, so these are moral arguments. These are arguments about representation that are being made. They definitely can be made, and I think they're probably justified in being made. The question is, are they legally going to hold up in court? Is there some mechanism where Democrats, for instance, I think the ACLU is probably going to get involved, probably the League's going to get involved in litigation here. What can they rely on legally to get a different map in place? And as I pointed out near the beginning of this, in terms of what is legally required out of district plans in Kansas is pretty minimal. They're not going to run into problems with equal population. All 4 of these districts have exactly the same population, according to the census. They might try to challenge on, Voting Rights Act types of lines. Again, disenfranchising racial or ethnic minorities is something that can be successful. The issue is that when we look at congressional districts in Kansas, neither the Black nor the Hispanic communities in the state are large enough and geographically kind of cohesive enough where they could be a majority minority district. Hitting majority status is not the requirement. There are cases where if, for instance, white voters can vote similarly to, let's say, Black voters, they can dip below that majority status and still have a required district. But in Kansas, we're talking about maybe a district that is 20% Hispanic is kind of the most you can get out of a congressional district, or maybe even 15% Hispanic or 15% Black, 20% Black. So we're very far away from hitting that like majority status. So they might have some success on that. And again, like representationally, morally, they might be correct here, but at least at the federal court level, there's just been a lot of leeway towards state legislatures being able to do what they want. Now, state courts, they might try to take a different approach. Like I said, since federal courts have stepped out of partisan gerrymandering, We have seen different strategies. Like I said, Pennsylvania has been successful here with reading protections into the state constitution. I'm not up to date with what that would look like in Kansas, but we might see that attempted. But at least on the congressional side, it might be a bit of an uphill struggle.
So there's not a lot they can do, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it's going to be difficult. They're going to try, and maybe they will have success in the state courts, but it would have to be something kind of a new avenue of argument that they would be successful on.
And then the question is there nothing that we can do?
At this point, I mean, had Democrats done just slightly better in 2018, or 2020, with the state legislature, being able to veto a plan and not having veto-proof majorities, it would have gotten kicked to the courts. And you never know. Maybe Democrats can convince. They only need a handful of state House members in the Republican Party to defect on this to sustain Governor Kelly's veto. So basic activism, contacting your elected officials could have some effect here. It's not like they have to get 30 Republicans on board. I think 3 or 4 might be enough to block a veto. But yeah, so course correction between 2020 and 2030. So again, so as I mentioned, there's a state level approach and there's a federal approach here. So federal courts aren't going to step in, but Congress could step in. And as I said, we've seen the House pass things on this. So they've passed bills that would require independent redistricting commissions, or at least some form of independent redistricting commission, where it wouldn't be the state legislature drawing these plans anymore. They've been blocked in the Senate. So it could happen. 2022 is not going to be a good year for Democrats in all likelihood. And it doesn't seem like the Republicans are on board with these types of reforms. But if in the interim, somewhere in between 2022 and 2030, Democrats do get a legislative majority in both chambers, at a certain point, the filibuster is probably going to be killed. They could pass some sort of requirement on this process, at least for congressional districts. For state reforms, we don't have this types of institutions that other states with protections against gerrymandering have. So it would probably come down to trying to convince the legislature to pass protections on this. What would that look like? Again, Republicans, because they have been the ones recently drawing the maps, having the majorities to draw the maps, why would they give up that power? In Illinois, for instance, why would Democrats want to give up the power to be able to draw congressional districts? So it might take a wave election where Democrats maybe come close to winning majorities, or if they come close to winning majorities and threaten that they could be the majority in 2030 for the next round of redrawing, Republicans might kind of mitigate some of the risk by introducing some of these independent redistricting options. Or again, Democrats might win a majority, and even if it's a temporary wave type election, they could put in those protections and keep them in place. But again, at a basic level, the question, if you're a sitting representative, is, if I vote for something that is a gerrymander, am I going to lose my election because of it? And generally that answer has been no. Even if people usually support gerrymandering reform, there aren't a lot of single issue redistricting voters. So, it is something where if there were more pressure on it, maybe representatives would take it more seriously, but I don't think that's where we are currently.
There is another question. as it's come out in Sedgwick County, they can redistrict between censuses. They don't have to wait 10 years to redistrict. And so the question is course correction possible in other years between the census of 2020 and 2030, which I'm sure is referring to the state level?
I see what you're saying. Yes. Oh, that's a good question. Some states don't allow mid-decade redistricting. I should know that offhand, whether or not Kansas is one of those states. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know that offhand. It's going to be a mix of answers if you're interested across the country. It's going to depend. But yeah, I mean, famously, like Texas in the mid-90s, once they won a majority of the state legislature, they really strongly gerrymandered the entire state, sorry, mid-2000s, and did that mid-decade redistricting. It actually used to be very common back in the early 20th century to do that. Once a party won the state, they would redraw the lines. But yeah, I don't specifically know the answer for Kansas, and I should. I apologize.
Are there any other questions that anyone cares to ask? Talk more about the veto.
Yeah, again, it's a bill like any other bill. So Governor Kelly could veto what the legislature passes. Again, I don't know if she has come out and said that she's going to veto this plan or any particular plan. But again, if she does, they just need that supermajority veto override, which if it's a party line vote, Republicans do have. But yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Are right at the 1 o'clock hour, and it's been very informative. I appreciated the back history, and it doesn't sound too good for Kansas to have a non-gerrymandered map. So at least we kind of know where we stand, and it will take public input to make any kind of difference in what's happening. Although you're saying that you think this map would stand the federal rules, correct?
Yeah, I would think so.
Okay, then maybe I shouldn't say gerrymandered. Thank you very much, and it was very informative, and thank you for giving a great presentation.
Thank you.